All right, so welcome to our session today, our Wednesday live session today on the origins of the American Revolution. This session is being recorded and it will be posted on Blackboard later in case you have to leave early or for those of you watching this recording later because you couldn't be here. So as always, if you have questions at any time during the presentation, those of you who are attending this live, go ahead and hit the raise hand button or type your questions in the chat, okay? All right, and I apologize about that. Having a Mac means that I can't turn off the push notifications on my text to my computer. So, all right. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about how the American Revolution gets its start. So we'll get up to the beginnings of the American Revolution today, but the focus of this live session is not to talk about the revolution itself, but more to get an understanding of why it happened. All right. So the big event that precedes the American Revolution that explains a lot of the grievances the colonists had about the British treatment of them that led to the American Revolution is what's known as the 7 Years' War. So all of the stuff we're going to talk about today as immediate causes for the American Revolution comes from the 7 Years' War as a consequence. So it's really important to kind of get an understanding of it. And you might notice if you're good at math that the 7 Years' War did not actually last 7 years. It lasted like 9 years. Historians are not great at naming things. Let's just put it at that. You may have heard it called the French and Indian War in your K through 12 education. This is kind of what it's called stateside. This war is the first war that is fought on a truly global scale. We see this war being... all of my family is texting me right now. I don't know why. They're all independently texting me questions. Anyways, so basically, it's fought in the North American colonies, it's fought in the Caribbean, it's fought back in Europe, and it's also fought in Asia. Part of the reason that this was a global scale war was it was fought between European colonial powers. So that means not only fighting back home in Europe, but also in their various colonies. The war actually gets started because of the American colonists. In particular, their desire to occupy the Ohio River Valley. Okay? The Ohio River Valley was in an area to the west of the existing colonies, and in particular, both Virginia and Pennsylvania wanted to expand further west as we got more colonists, right? As you've been reading, there's demand for more land, and there's this push to the west. And so we have a couple different colonies laying claim to the right to expand into the Ohio River Valley. However, whose territory is that? Is that British territory? Who technically claims the Ohio River Valley at this time? Is it British? Anybody know? If I'm asking you if it's British, the answer is probably no. Do you know whose territory it is? What European power lays claim? Any guesses? Hint, look at the name of the war. What we call it.
The French and Indian War?
Yes. So the French say, no, this is our territory. You can't come in here. And so what happens is that we get drawn into this war because the colonists want to expand to the British colonists want to expand to the west. The French say, no, this is our territory. The Native Americans say, no to both of y'all. This is our territory. And so we get everybody involved in war because we want more land. So this war lasts, unlike the name suggests, it lasts actually for 9 years. A lot of colonists get military experience from this war, serving in militias to help the British Army fight against the French and the Native Americans. George Washington leads a failed effort to build a Fort Necessity. General Edward Braddock launches a disastrous campaign against a French fort that they constructed to try to hold their ground at Fort Duquesne, which is located in modern-day Pittsburgh. Initially, the war doesn't go very well, and in fact, the English colonists get pushed farther to the east by advances of French and Native Americans. But it's only when the British seek other European allies to help them out and to divide the French forces between their various colonies that we finally start to see the war turn in favor of the British. So the British and their allies in Europe defeat the French in the 7 Years' War, and the Peace of Paris in 1763, which formally ends the war, greatly reshuffles the map in terms of who has what territory in the Americas. The French give up almost all of their North American territory to the British. So this is when the French give up their claim to Quebec in Canada. Spain gains Louisiana from France because the Spanish helped the British. So Louisiana goes from French to Spanish, and we'll eventually go back to French before we get it for reasons that we're not going to talk about today. But essentially, the map gets redrawn, and now the British have a huge chunk of territory to expand westward into. The problem, however, so here we see all this area in the light pink is new territory that the British gain because of the 7 Years' War. Okay. Now, here's the problem, though. Remember, the French have given this up, but Native Americans still live here. And as your textbook talked about, there is this rebellion of Native Americans led by Pontiac against the idea of the British expanding into this newly acquired territory. And so because of Pontiac's rebellion, the British declare in the Proclamation of 1763 that nobody can go into this new territory, that this is forbidden to colonists, that they cannot go west of this line that you see. So the darker pink on this map that you're looking at is the British colonies as they exist during the 7 Years' War. And basically the British go, I know you guys really wanted this westward territory, and that's why we got involved in this war, but it's too much of a pain in the butt to defend colonists from these Native Americans who are mad, so you can't go there. Okay. How do Americans, well, prototypical Americans, they're not Americans yet, how do you think the colonists respond to being told they can't do this? They can't settle into this land just outside the boundary.
They were probably mad and fought back.
Yes, they were very mad, and some of them ignored it and said, I'm going to go west of this line anyways. This is how Kentucky gets started as a colony. So this is going to be a point of contention for the colonists. They're mad that they fought this war over this territory, they gained this territory, and then the British say, no, you can't go there. So that's going to be one sore point between the colonists and back home in England. The other thing is that the war brings British attention more towards the colonies. For a long time, as you've been reading your textbook, the British government essentially practiced what in a fancy term is called salutatory neglect. I'm tripping over the word here. Basically, it means they left the colonies alone. They didn't pay a lot of attention to the colonies. But now that they had to fight this very expensive war, they're going to be looking at, and the colonies started it, they're going to be looking at the colonies more closely. So there's a couple of reasons that the British start to rethink how they're approaching the North American colonies. One is that they now have a lot more land, right? Having gained all of this territory that was previously occupied by the French. So that means that they have a much larger empire in North America than they had before, and that requires money to run more efficiently, and it also requires money to pay off debt from the war. Okay? So one of the things that the British wanted to do was to really make sure that they were getting their money's worth out of these North American colonies, and getting them to pay their fair share. For example, the British had tried to regulate trade in the colonies before. You were reading in your textbook about the Navigation Acts, and the colonists kind of ignored the trade rules. Now the British are going to enforce them, right? Because when the colonists ignore the trade rules, it's difficult, if not impossible, for the British to enforce things like taxes on trade. Okay, so we're going to see the desire to regulate the colonies more closely, so the British are getting the maximum revenue out of these colonies, and also to avoid getting drawn into another war because the colonists are poking at foreign power. There's also the idea that the colonists we're still embracing this concept known as direct representation. In other words, what we see with the colonial assemblies, right, the governments, is that you're directly electing your representative, right, who's your voice in these colonial assemblies. But back home in Britain, they've moved on to a concept known as virtual representation, where they say, regardless of who elected these elected officials represent all subjects of the British Empire. So in other words, according to them, you don't have to have direct representation in order to be represented, right? You don't have to directly elect the people sitting in Parliament back home, the British equivalent of Congress, for them to represent you. So this is going to be a sticking point too, because they have very different ideas over political representation, and that's going to come to a head over the issue of taxes. So the 7 Years' War, just to kind of recap in a nutshell, is going to cost a lot of money. So it means the British government goes into a lot of debt, having to fight a war across 3 different continents. In fact, they borrowed 150 million pounds. Pounds is the British unit of currency. To give you an idea of what that is in today's money, that's tens of trillions of dollars that they borrowed, right? And if you borrow something, you got to pay it back. And so they felt that the colonies, because they started the war, should probably contribute to paying that back. So the British government is going to crack down on the colonies because they want to get their money's worth out of them, and they want the colonies to contribute to paying off this massive war debt. Okay, so that's going to be one of the things that really kicks off a lot of the other colonial grievances that lead to the Revolutionary War, is this issue of the British now wanting to get paid back for coming to the colonists' defense in a war that they started, and then the colonists objecting to the way that the British go about it. So taxes is at the root of all of this, but it's related to this war. All right, so how are the British going to get money out of the colonists to pay for this war? They pass a lot of taxes. And initially, the colonists, while they might not like these taxes, they're basically done in a way that affects the whole British Empire, so they can't complain too much. Like, for example, the Sugar Act actually lowers taxes on molasses, which is a sugar product, but there's also language within the Sugar Act passed in 1764 that cracks down on smuggling or ignoring trade rules. In particular, Americans who have been smuggling a lot to avoid these onerous trade rules the British had tried to pass will now be tried in admiralty courts. So even though these smugglers are civilians, they're now being tried in Navy courts for the crime of smuggling. And the reason that the British put this language into the Sugar Act is whenever they arrested somebody for smuggling and they put them on trial in a civilian court, the colonists kept finding them not guilty because they didn't see a problem with smuggling. And so when the colonists were tried by a jury of their peers, the jury almost always let them off the British don't like this, and so they move the venue of the trial to one where they can kind of control and have more likelihood of a successful prosecution and the person being found guilty. The Revenue Act tries to raise more tax revenue, as it says, by targeting goods that previously hadn't been taxed or hadn't had restrictions on transportation. So again, trying to get more money. So things like wool and animal hides that previously really hadn't been subject to these trade rules or taxes are now being regulated. And then the Currency Act is an interesting one. It reinforces earlier bans on paper currency. We use paper currency much more than hard currency like coins, right? Today, part of the reason we use paper currency so much is it's easier to carry and we don't have to have the hard coins in hand. Paper currency at this point is not issued by governments, it's issued by banks, and basically the paper currency back during this time period is like an IOU. So the idea is if somebody gave you a paper note, that you could take that note to the issuing bank and you could say, I want to cash this in for the equivalent amount in gold or silver. So it's not quite like our modern currency functions. And one of the reasons the colonists liked paper currency is that gold and silver were in relatively short supply. So you're limiting your economic growth without this kind of promissory note, which is the function of these paper currencies. So you can kind of understand they're trying to avoid inflation, right, or an economic depression if everybody goes to cash in at once and there's not enough hard currency. But at the same time, this makes trade more difficult for the colonists. Any questions so far? All right. Now, all of those things were regulating trade, and again, regulating trade across the British Empire. The first direct tax that Parliament passes on the colonies is the Stamp Act. Okay. This was not a let's go ahead and regulate an area of the economy. This was a direct tax, particularly targeting the colonies. So the Stamp Act tax was a tax on all paper products, okay, all printed goods. So you'd have to pay this tax if you bought books, newspapers, if you had a legal contract drawn up. All of these paper goods had to have a stamp issued by the British government that you had to pay for in order to be sold or to be processed. So if this tax is on all paper goods, who does it affect? Who do you think feels the effects of the Stamp Act? Newspapers for sure, right? Newspaper editors are not happy. This is going to kind of cut into their circulation. Yes, good observation, Tori. Is this going to affect one social class more than another? Like, are we talking about the same impact to like rich people versus poor people? What do you guys think? Books at this time are cheaper and easier to get than they once were, but they're still relatively expensive and rare. So Tori's asking, poor people less. For the most part, yes, right? Because poor people probably aren't buying books in a great volume, maybe not buying newspapers. But the fact that even your basic legal contracts, like an indentured contract or a marriage contract or a birth certificate, all of these official government things are still subject to it, that's where it's going to hit everybody equally, right? So poor people aren't, necessarily buying these paper products at the same level as rich people, but they still have to engage in official contracts and things like that, paperwork from the state. So this means everybody's going to be affected, but rich people a little bit more because of their consumption of books and newspapers. The middle class in particular is really upset because they still read books and newspapers, but they don't have as much money as rich people. And then elite people, even though they could afford this tax fairly easily, were upset because they saw passing such a tax as the responsibility of the colonial assemblies not Parliament. Because again, the idea of direct representation. If you're going to pass a tax that affects us, we need to have a voice in that passage, right? In that debate. We need to have representation in Parliament if you're going to pass this kind of stuff, because otherwise we don't have a voice in this discussion. Okay, they said it's one thing if you want to pass trade regulations for the whole British Empire, sure, but a direct tax on us, the colonies, without our consent, without our participation, that's no, we don't like that. So colonists insisted that it was their right as freeborn Englishmen to be governed by laws passed by their elected representatives, and that because Parliament did not have elected representatives from the colonists, that this was a violation of their English liberty, their rights as Englishmen. Okay? The British, however, fought back against this. They go, look, if we treat you special, then we have to treat all of the other colonies across, the world that we have as equally special. And that's going to make it almost impossible to govern our large empire properly, because everybody's going to want different things if we give them more level of self-government. So we're kind of at this impasse. The British go, no, we have to regulate everybody the same. We don't let, like you're represented even if you don't elect people. And then the colonists going, no, it's not legit unless we have a say in the passage of this. So the colonists actually get together across different colonies in a group known as the Stamp Act Congress. 9 of the colonies of the 13 send representatives. They pass a resolution saying, look, we're still loyal to the king. We recognize the authority of Parliament, but we gotta have elected representatives in Parliament because this is just wrong to pass taxes on us without that. So the Stamp Act is universally unpopular. The colonists respond by boycotting British products, okay, by basically saying we refuse to buy any British-made products. Individual cities and towns form committees that organize resistance to these new taxes. And then there's a group that pops up called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was founded originally in New York amongst the working class. It's very popular amongst craftsmen and artisans, and they organize protests against these taxes. In some cases, they harass tax officials. They destroy shipments of these stamps, and the British consider them terrorists because they're destroying property, they're harassing people. The Sons of Liberty will be an important group throughout the lead up to the American Revolution. This will not be the last time we talk about them today. But elites were very alarmed by this behavior as well, because they can't control these folks, these lower class folks who are protesting. And sometimes these protests devolved into violence. Mob violence, particularly addressed at, again, officials or military outposts of the British. So the British are being hurt in the pocketbook by colonists not buying British products, by boycotting. And these British merchants start appealing to the government to get rid of this unpopular tax, which Parliament does. They repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, so only a year after it was originally passed, and then they immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which is basically a giant middle finger to the colonists, because the act essentially says Parliament has the right to impose taxes on the colonies without their direct representation. So it's basically a big FU to the colonists. By the way, what's going on in this political cartoon from the time period is these protesters are staging a mock funeral for liberty. So they're saying that their freedoms are being trampled on by this unjust tax, and so they're holding a funeral for freedom. Very dramatic. Kind of hints of performance art in this protest. All right. So while the colonies are going through this spat with the British government over representation and taxes, there's also increasingly conflict going on between the sort of colonial elite and the lower classes. You already read a little bit about these kinds of conflicts when you read about Bacon's Rebellion, right, which, contrary to its name, is not actually food poisoning, right, but an uprising by indentured servants and slaves. There's a lot of tensions between the elites and the lower classes. There's a movement called the Regulators in the Carolinas, which is somewhat confusing because even though this movement in these two colonies have the same name, they're very different. The Regulators in South Carolina were wealthy landowners who felt that they were not represented adequately in the assembly, and that the government wasn't doing a good job to reinforce the rule of law and protect their land claims in the western part of the state. The Regulators in North Carolina, I would argue, are the ones that are a little bit more important to remember. North Carolina, the Regulators were a movement of small farmers. And these farmers complained that the colonial government was corrupt because they made it very difficult for people to obtain land because you had to pay high fees and taxes on this land. And then in order to be able to vote or to become a representative in the colonial assemblies, they had a very high requirement for the amount of land that you had. So a lot of these small farmers felt that the colonial assembly was dominated by these very large landowners who did not have their best interest in heart. At one point, 8,000 armed farmers show up demanding more say in local government and ending the dominance of a small group of elites. And this movement is actually only ended in 1771 when the North Carolina colonial government sends in the militia to break up this armed protest. Similarly, we see an uprising of small-scale farmers in New York. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are a group of tenant farmers who start to rebel against large landowners in New York and New England. Tenant farmers are farmers who rent the land. They do not own the land, right? So they're renting from a wealthier, larger landowner. And in particular, there's this territory that is kind of being claimed by different colonies, again, kind of in the West. And so small-scale farmers start defending their land claims. They're trying to break away from these landowners and claim the land for themselves in the Green Mountain region. And Ethan Allen, in particular, leads this cohort of farmers who push back against colonial militias trying to boot them out of this land. In fact, Ethan Allen claimed that the colony of New York wanted to enslave them because they wanted to take away this land. And this is how Vermont is born. So this is the origins of the state of Vermont, is all these rebellious small-scale farmers who are rebelling against these wealthy landowners. So there's a lot of tension between the elite and the less well-off. And this is going to make some members of the colonial elite really reluctant when we get to the American Revolution to support the revolution, in part because they're concerned that they don't have the armed backup necessary to quash the protesting lower classes if it comes to it, if we get rid of the British. All right, now we get a second wave of taxes after the Stamp Act was unsuccessful. There's a new sheriff in town, so to speak. There's a new finance minister in the British government, Charles Townshend, and he designs a new set of taxes in the legislation that's named after him, the Townshend Acts. These taxes do a variety of things. They're designed to regulate trade. They try to streamline collecting taxes on designated goods and to get rid of smuggling. And one of the things that Townshend very cleverly does is he decides that the British government is going to directly pay the salaries of high-ranking officials in the colonies. Because prior to this, the colonial assemblies held the purse strings. So if the governor did something, the governor of a colony did something that the assembly didn't like, they just threatened to not pay him until he caved into their demands. But now that the British government's directly paying officials like governors of colonies, then they don't have that bargaining chip anymore. Okay. The colonists really, again, don't like these rules imposed. They're moving on from opposing Parliament taxing them directly to just opposing any kind of attempt at regulation or tax by Parliament. And so there's again this move to try to boycott products that are imported. So that's what we call the non-importation movement. There's this boycott against anything that's not only British produced and made, but also anything imported, because any imports were taxed. So even something coming from another nation, like say France, like just to not buy, because then you'd have to pay a special tax on the import to the British government. So the idea was buy American made, right? Buy homegrown. So you had a group called the Daughters of Liberty, who were women who supported this boycott of British and imported products by trying to make their own. So for example, spinning and weaving their own cloth at home rather than buy British cloth for clothing. Many people jumped onto this not just because they felt that this was a great way to protest, but it's also a great way to save money, especially if you're a Southern planter who oftentimes spent a lot of money and went into debt to try to keep up the appearances of luxury. You could now say, oh, well, I'm not buying the latest fashions from Europe because I feel strongly about those taxes, right? Not because it's also going to save me lots of money. The boycott is very popular amongst craftsmen and artisans, right? People who produce stuff at home, but not as popular amongst merchants who lose a lot of business, and they also fear being targeted for violence by carrying imported products. Where we're really going to start to heat up in the lead up to the American Revolution is in the early 1770s in Boston. Massachusetts is the problem child colony. They are the most rebellious colony, pushing against these British taxes. And in fact, British troops had been regularly stationed in the city of Boston since 1768, when the British seized a colonial smuggling ship belonging to none other than John Hancock, whose giant signature on the Constitution is where we get the nickname of Put Your John Hancock when we say you need to sign something. So the colonists riot when the British seize this ship that John Hancock had used for smuggling. And so the British realized that Boston is this hotbed of protests and resistance, and they needed to watch it closely. Now, British troops, in addition to being stationed in Boston, which Bostonians were not happy about, British troops, when they were off duty, were allowed to get outside work. And so that's the other component that Bostonians didn't like, was now they had soldiers competing for jobs, particularly in areas like on the docks. All of this tension over the British occupation of Boston comes to a head with the Boston Massacre in 1770. On March 5th, a scuffle between British troops and colonists escalates into a full-blown firefight. And you can see this depicted here in this engraving by a gentleman named Paul Revere. You may know Paul Revere for the kind of ride, right, to warn the colonists, the British are coming, the British are coming. But Paul Revere was also an influential silversmith, an engraver, and a member of that Sons of Liberty group. And this becomes the image circulated across newspapers and pamphlets in the colonies depicting what happens at the Boston Massacre. So if we look at this image by Revere, what do you get out of this? Like, if somebody asked you to describe what happened at the Boston Massacre, looking at this, what would you say? Anybody want to volunteer? What's going on in this image?
If you don't mind, I see him depicting the British just killing a bunch of unarmed, civilians, which, as far as I read, was extremely inaccurate.
Yeah, you're right, Tori. This makes it look like the British are just firing on innocent civilians. But as Tori mentioned, when you read the textbook and you read accounts of it, you know that's not the case, that the colonists were actually doing things like throwing rocks at the troops. And so they're not these like innocents being mowed down by the British. So why would Revere depict it inaccurately like this? What's the point?
Probably for propaganda against the British, since he was extremely, I guess, patriotic and wanted to depict them in the most evil form, I guess. So everybody would go against them as well.
Right. So propaganda, as Tori mentioned, right, is an attempt to sway people, right, to believe a certain thing. So in this case, Revere is drawing it this way to try to get people to look at the British badly, right? One of the first people to die in this massacre is actually Crispus Attucks. And so for this reason, he's often dubbed the first martyr of the American Revolution, which is kind of interesting because Attucks was a sailor of African, Indian, and English descent. So oftentimes he's kind of overlooked when we talk about the American Revolution because he's not a white dude. So the response to the British, the Boston Massacre was an escalation of tensions. Merchants on both sides of the Atlantic complained about the Townshend Act, saying it led to violence, it's leading to low revenue, and the boycott ends by 1770. Okay. So the boycott ends later that year after the Boston Massacre, but tensions are still high. And the British are not done trying to tax the Americans. The Tea Act in 1773 was basically a government bailout of the British East India Company that allowed them to dump huge quantities of tea on the American market. Now, on one hand, this should make Americans happy, right? Because if you have, according to economics, if you have a lot of supply, what does that do to price of a product if there's a lot of it available? Does price go up or down? It lowers, right? It goes down. So colonists should be happy, right? Their tea is cheaper. The problem is that this undersells a lot of Americans who have been importing tea. And again, there's this protest that this is still an imposition on the colonial economy. And so the Sons of Liberty on December 16th, 1773, staged the Boston Tea Party, in which they dumped 300 barrels of tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, disguised as Native Americans. And just so that you know, that caused about, in today's money, $4 million of damaged product. Okay? So not small. And the British were pissed at this. And so they passed they didn't call it the Intolerable Acts. This is the nickname given to it by the colonists, the Intolerable Acts, which basically was designed to punish Massachusetts colony, and Boston in particular. So they actually closed the port of Boston to trade until Boston repaid the cost of the damaged tea. They modified the Massachusetts Colonial Charter to restrict town meetings and the number of officials elected, which really upsets Massachusetts, which had this long history of direct representation. And the British also said that they could force you to house soldiers in your home against your will, without your permission, that you could be required to let soldiers stay at your house. Okay. So this was very, very troubling to the colonists. Now, even though the Intolerable Acts are designed mainly to punish Massachusetts, the other colonies don't like it because they recognize that if this happens to Massachusetts, this could be done to any of the other colonies. And so opposition to the Intolerable Acts, well, it's very, very strong in Massachusetts. Joy apparently has opinions on that. Really gets protests across the colonies as well. And so representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia's the oddball out, gathered together at a meeting called the Continental Congress. And they tried to discuss together, how should we respond to the Intolerable Acts? How can we work together to kind of create a unified response across these very different colonies to these acts? And colonies send kind of some of their top folks to this meeting. For example, the Massachusetts representatives were the Adams cousins, John Adams, who will be our second president, and his cousin that you probably know a little bit better, Samuel Adams, for his brewery. George Washington and Patrick Henry are sent from Virginia. This is where Patrick Henry gives his very famous speech that you probably know the end tag of, give me liberty or give me death. Okay? But also in that same speech, more interestingly to me, Patrick Henry talks about how the British attacks on the colonies really have brought these different colonies together. He says in his speech, the distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. Because before this, the colonies all have very different identities. They were very different from each other. They didn't see each other as united. I mean, they all saw themselves as Englishmen, but they didn't see themselves as distinctly together in these colonies. So this is something that's really new and different. For the first time, these very different colonies are defining themselves as being together as a distinct identity, an American identity. So the constitutional, not the constitutional, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's next week. We talk about the Constitution next week. The Continental Congress adopted what's known as the Suffolk Resolves, which was their strategy for how to oppose this. And they agreed that if they didn't have resolution to this conflict with the British within a year, that they would meet again. Okay? They also organized the Continental Association, which was designed to coordinate colonial protests against these British laws and also to coordinate a continued boycott of British products. At the local levels, there's also committees of safety. These were local organizations designed to organize boycotts against the British, but also to continue this tradition of self-government, including in places like Massachusetts, right, where the British had tried to strip self-government. These committees were, even though they're organized by elites, usually in these communities, they give a voice to middle and lower class people who very often didn't really get to participate very much in these kinds of political discussions before. The colonists make this appeal to the British that not only are they violating their rights as Englishmen with these regulations, but also their natural rights, right? So a predecessor to what we would call our human rights, right? That we get by virtue of being born free and human, not by being a citizen of a particular state. All right, so how do we get from protest to full-blown war? The war begins in 1775, in part because these local committees of safety, in addition to organizing boycotts and having meetings about self-government, also started to recognize that because of the Boston Massacre, there was potential for violence. And so one of the things that they wanted to prepare for was to defend themselves if the British carried out violence. And so the British got wind of the town of Concord in Massachusetts having a stockpile of local weapons for the local militia. And this was the town that was warned of the advance of the British by Paul Revere, and also other people, including the teenage Sybil Ludington, who actually rode farther than Paul Revere did to warn these Massachusetts towns about the British. And so the British, in trying to go and seize these weapons from what they saw as the rebellious colonists, ended up engaged in battle at the towns of Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts. So this is the first armed conflict. This is the first battle of the American Revolution. And for that reason, the first shot fired at Concord is oftentimes labeled as the shot heard round the world, because this is what kicks off the American Revolution. So the British, again, kind of initially feel like this is just Massachusetts being rebellious Massachusetts again. And some of the early conflicts are fought in Massachusetts, Concord and Lexington, but also the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, in which the British and the colonists are fighting over control of the city of Boston. Eventually, the city of Boston will be captured by American forces in the following year. So the Battle of Bunker Hill is not successful for the colonists. Also technically fought on Breed's Hill, which is the neighboring hill. Name misconfusion. So the Americans don't capture full control of Boston until 1776. But the conflict starts to spread outside of Massachusetts. In the New York colony, Fort Ticonderoga, in May of 1775, is taken over by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. They demand the surrender of the British troops at this fort. So the armed conflict is spreading. Now, the Second Continental Congress, right, because they said in a year, if the problem is not gone, we meet again. Well, the problem has escalated. So the Second Continental Congress meets. This time, Georgia does send representatives, so it's all 13 colonies. And they have to make a decision. They have to decide how to respond to the fact that this is now escalated into armed conflict. So the Second Continental Congress authorizes the creation of a continental army, made up of all colonies, and funded by the Second Continental Congress to fight the British troops. And they're going to appoint George Washington to lead this army. They do this for two reasons. Number one, he did have military experience from the 7 Years' War, but also number two, he's from Virginia, and regional politics matter. Again, Massachusetts is kind of the rebellious child of the colonies. They'd consistently fought against the British, but support to fight against the British was weaker in the South. So what the Continental Congress was hoping was by appointing someone from the South to lead the Continental Army, that this would get some of the more reluctant people in these southern colonies on board. Now, it's real important to note here, one of the great misconceptions of the American Revolution is that we went into this angling for independence from day one. The answer is no. When these folks met at the Second Continental Congress and authorized the creation of the Continental Army, they still felt like there was a chance to resolve their differences with the British. The colonists, when they're talking about this early conflict, in fact, create the Olive Branch Petition, in which they send a letter to King George III and they say, hey, look, we know we have our differences. We want to make up. Just give us direct representation in Parliament and we're cool. And King George III didn't want to listen to that. So it's not really going to be until 1776 that the mood in the colonies shifts away from we're going to fight this and then we're going to make up with the British and we're going to continue being colonies to, hey, why don't we break away, become independent, become a new nation? And Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which you have a selection from in your textbook, plays a huge role in shifting that conversation towards independence. I'll go ahead and post, in addition to this recording, I'll post the recording I did with a class last semester talking about some of the top 10 myths of the American Revolution for y'all to watch, since we're not talking about the revolution itself today. But this is in a nutshell how we get involved in the revolution. So if somebody ever asks you, why did the American Revolution happen? The short answer is taxes, right? The longer answer is, again, this issue of representation over taxes. That was really Americans were concerned about. Anybody have any questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.